I very rarely actually come up and speak. My name is Ron. You don't recognize me from before. We have two fine speakers today. Kelly McCormack is new to AUG, is an Adobe certified instructor of many programs. He's a web developer and a very creative gentleman. And so he's going to be speaking primarily about CSS3, but other animation platforms as well. So I'll let him take it from there. Part two, for those of you who maybe down in our early, will be by one of our co-managers here, Rich, who will be speaking on another way to do animation on web as well. Okay, so that's our theme for the evening. Thank you for coming. We'll go ahead and get started. Kelly.
Welcome, everybody. So, I need to start the recording. I think it is recording. Anyway, yeah, my name's Kelly. I have been making websites for 20 years and started doing animation back on the Amiga days. That was fun. Saw the rise and fall of the Flash splash page in the late 90s. And anyway, I'm a designer, mainly front-end development is what I do these days. And I work up the street at Laughlin Constable, which is an ad agency. It's a fun place to be. So what I'm going to do here today is take you on a whirlwind tour of everything you might want to be exposed to relating to web animation in the modern day. So if you want to refer to this later, the URL is up there. I'll post it in the meetup group comments afterwards too. But it's just kellymccormack.com/resources/animation. And what I have here is, again, a pretty long list that we're going to try to buzz through in an hour. And I'm going to try to demo Edge Animate for you. So just scroll through it really quick, first of all. Do a little bit of intro discussion, what is animation. Then I'm going to talk about native stuff, CSS3 and JavaScript APIs. Some of that's totally usable right now. Some of it's kind of cutting edge. So we'll talk about stuff. I'll show you some examples where you can find more info. Talk about JavaScript libraries. This is kind of the the workhorse of modern animation. Some of this has been around for a few years, which is great. A lot of backwards compatibility there. So that's good stuff. Video, Adobe Muse, and again, I'm going to culminate in a discussion of Edge Animate and a little demo on that. I'll hand it off to Rich for Flash. So, and I guess as I move my mouse, you can see my site has some basic parallax and kind of most of the things I'm going to show you, there's a little bit sprinkled in just for fun. So, how many of you might have experienced web animation, would you say? Okay, good amount of people. If you've made an animated GIF, you've made web animation. So everybody's probably done that. All right, and would any of you call yourselves developers, JavaScript programmers at all? Okay, cool. Basically, web animation often involves JavaScript, so being sort of a hybrid designer-developer is pretty common these days, and it's definitely something, if you want to get into web animation, you might want to, start looking in that direction. And some of it's pretty easy, some of it's extremely complicated, but I'll try to give you an overview of everything. So first of all, what is animation? Changing things over time, that's animation. So that can apply to a lot of different things. Animation can mean lots of different things, lots of different people. But basically, it adds interest, it adds movement, it adds time. Instead of a static something, you have time. Things can change. And the neat thing about web animation is that things can change interactively based on user interactions, based on time events, based on GeoIP, based on almost anything these days. So there's like a limitless amount of HTML5, JavaScript APIs, with mobile devices and everything. So you can do just about anything these days. That's kind of the neat point that we're in. So where we were with web animation, really back in the early days, when Flash came along, it was so powerful and so good, it just won. Everybody used Flash if you wanted web animation. I'm hard pressed to even think of any other techniques that we used to use. Although even like Dreamweaver version 0.9, when I started using it, had JavaScript-based simple timeline animation. That was actually pretty neat. Then they got rid of that, I think, in CS something. But anyway, that was kind of baked in. But anyway, so there's Flash, there's maybe Dreamweaver, there was some JavaScript out there, but it wasn't really that common. And we're always limited by browsers, by the technology, by the browser wars, different browsers supporting different things. You had to have plugins. So that was always quite a hassle. So at this point, quite a few years ago, CSS3 came along, JavaScript became more standardized, more accepted, browsers started doing things the right way. Microsoft started playing along and making Internet Explorer work like other browsers somewhat. Speak up. Yeah. So so nowadays we're finally done sort of waiting for CSS3 to be adopted. People have the browsers do what they're supposed to. So a lot of the technology is very usable these days that wasn't even a couple years ago. And for a lot of corporate purposes, we still have to maybe consider IE8. So a lot of this stuff will not work in Internet Explorer 8 or even 9 or 10. And some of the latest stuff is even limited to, Chrome only or Chrome plus you have to have a graphics processor to support WebGL, things like that. But anyway, we can do a whole lot more than we used to. So first of all, I'm going to talk about native stuff. So this means, again, your browser, most browsers, modern browsers, support CSS3. You can use it. CSS4 is even on the horizon now, so CSS3 better work, and it does. There's also JavaScript APIs, meaning using JavaScript to do animation in a browser without having a third-party library. It's native JavaScript, accessing properties much like native CSS3. The benefit of that is good performance. A lot of animation stuff is obviously pretty intensive for processors, for graphics cards, for things like that, especially with mobile devices. If you've got a crazy super parallax animated website, it's probably not going to work on an Android 2.3 phone. Just have to accept some of those things. But anyway, when you get more into animation for web, you really do want to care about performance. That does count. The more complex things get, the bigger sites are. If you want to give a good experience to users and not just crash every other person who looks at your site on an old iPad, you've got to think about that. So CSS3 performs very well. It allows the browser basically to prioritize what it's doing. Instead of being forced to try to render a high frame rate, it'll handle that for you. So that's a good aspect of it. So the three CSS3 things here that I'm talking about, transforms, transitions, and keyframes, these are all sort of interrelated, used with each other oftentimes. And I'd say they're kind of progressively, more powerful. So first of all, CSS3 transforms. This isn't really animation itself, but the transform property lets you do things like move things, rotate, scale, use perspective, things like that. So very commonly used with animation. And these are separated into 2D and 3D. So 2D transforms, for example, this is the caniuse.com site, which is your best friend if you do this for a living and you have requirements that things have to work in certain browsers. So 2D transforms work in all kind of modern browsers. And this is what I always have to deal with, is how far back in Internet Explorer do things work. So that's good to know. So I've got resources for all these things, just kind of the best, simplest introductory resources. The Mozilla developer website here has a lot of really good information. It's pretty concise, but it does go into depth, and it's pretty easy to read. So here, for example, is a list of transform properties. So this is what the CSS styles will look like. Translate, which is movement, so you can translate X horizontally, Y vertically, and I guess there isn't translate Z, is there? But, oh yeah, there is. So Z is coming at you. So a lot of this is going to be very similar to Flash if you use Flash. Almost any animation system uses coordinates, Cartesian coordinates. So scale, rotate. There's also matrix properties, which are a little more complicated and abstract, but matrix sort of combines all other things into an unreadable long string of all the properties. Anyway, so let's transform. That's an example of rotate. So if you just make that style happen, that's what it's going to do. So with animation, of course, you'd want to trigger that to happen at a certain point in time with maybe like a hover effect.
Question?
Was that when you clicked on that box and it became larger, was that an example of the scale transform triggered by your click?
Yes. Yeah, so I have actually I have this locally here. Yeah, I'll pull this up real quick. So I'm using brackets here for looking at some code. And I am a PC user, so I'm a little slower here. There you go. Yes. Well, that's the transition property, actually. Yeah, so this isn't a transform, actually. But you could do that with a transform.
I thought it might have been.
That's another thing. There's lots of different ways you can often do the same thing. So that,
Quick question or two. So that matrix property,
yeah.
You said that represents every CSS3. It's like a compiled version of
it's a matrix will let you access most, if not all, of these properties all at once.
So does it have performance advantages? Do you compile to that basically, or is it just?
I don't know that, actually. I would imagine it could be faster. But any CSS3 is going to be pretty fast compared to some other things. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. You can obviously do multiple things. Translate, rotate, and translate X and Y. Anyway, so that's transforms. Very well supported. The 3D transforms, like these, are not quite as supported. So that's worth noting. 2D and 3D are separate. Still pretty well, yeah, only I9, that's the big difference. So I don't really care too much about that. Okay. Anyway, let me move on here for you. Stuck on the basics. Okay, so transitions. So this is a CSS3 property that does allow you to change things over time. So instead of just having a normal, let's say a hover link where you put your mouse over something and it just switches immediately, transitions let you specify an amount of time that would take place over, including things like easing. So that's very useful. So I've got a lot of transitions on this site. This effect here, jQuery is adding a class to what I'm clicking on, and that is right down here. So a simple little jQuery thing. You click on. So you click on one of these elements. It's going to remove the highlight CSS class from everything and then add it to what you clicked on. Simple. And that highlight class is up here. So the highlight class has the new properties, and this is the key point for the CSS transition property. So in the basic style that's always there on those elements, there's a transition property, and it's, I could say transition background or font size or padding, but in this case I've said all, so it's going to transition any property there is that changes. So that's kind of the easy way to do it. It would be more better performance if I just did certain properties, let's say. And over the course of 5 seconds, that's going to happen. And I put this on the main style so that, again, it transitions on and off. It's a little janky because, font sizes are kind of changing, and I did this very, very quickly and, didn't really control that too much. But anyway, that's a transition. So that's a way to make nice, hover styles. Add some delay. Even something as simple as that adds a lot of softness, subtle effects to the site. And actually, my logo up here, which is SVG, that does translate 3D. So it actually rotates back on the y-axis. It's kind of hard to see because it's behind stuff. Anyway, so yeah, CSS3 transitions and Mozilla stuff, again, very good for that. And this is another thing, only certain CSS properties are going to be animatable. It's, anything you'd want to use is probably going to be fine. But if you're trying to do something and it doesn't work, that's one place to look. Is this property animatable? Yes, browser prefixes. That's another thing to know about. So some of these properties, like transition it's pretty well accepted now. Especially back when it was in its infancy, if you wanted to use it in browsers, let's say 3 years ago, you probably had to use this browser prefix. So WebKit transition, so that would be Chrome, any browser that's based on the Chrome engine. So transition is the main property that hopefully all modern browsers use, but maybe older versions of Chrome browsers or ones built into Android or Safari. If you're trying to do something using transition and it doesn't work in some browser or device, that's definitely a place you want to look. Do I need to add a browser prefix? And some of these things, CSS3 properties require a lot of browser prefixing, so that can be pretty tedious. So there's ways to speed that up. I'll show you an example of that. And the Can I Use site would be one that should list. And this doesn't have it. And there's always, some browsers don't support certain properties or certain things. So, you do want to kind of read this if you're going to use it extensively, and you have to have it work perfectly on everything. But basically, CSS3 transforms and transitions are probably the most supported, able to be used things out there right now. And CSS3 keyframes, I've been playing with this a lot lately. This is pretty slick. So this is beyond the simple transform, where you don't really have any control over the middle states or as much control over how it applies to things. CSS3 keyframes lets you actually define keyframes. See, basically, you have a normal rule that tells a CSS selector to reference a named keyframe rule, and that contains the keyframes. Here is an example of that. So, Okay, so the important stuff here is, all right. So this style is what sort of makes the animation happen. Go is this little checkbox here. Checked is a newer property. So it's basically a way of triggering something through CSS without JavaScript. And when I check this, it tells the ball that is next to it to do this. So again, this is one that even in current Chrome requires a prefix. WebKit animation. So that's a basic selector with the addition of the WebKit animation property, which tells it to look for this keyframes rule, ball bounce, which is defined right here. So it's pretty simple. And there's some, there's a lot of nice properties here, like the duration, looping, so you can control how many times it loops. This is set to loop infinitely, and alternate directions as it's looping. Super simple, pretty cool. If you need just sort of single elements to do things, that's what this stuff's pretty good for.
Can objects swap out? Swap out the images?
You could, you certainly could in some way. This is just a div tag actually, with the border radius making it look like a circle. Swapping an image out, let's say at a certain point in time. Well, yeah, I guess if you were using background images through CSS, one of these keyframe rules could change the background image. That would probably work.
That's all being done through CSS.
Yes, right here. This is everything that is making that happen, as far as the animation part. A couple other things up here. Again, this is the style of the ball. So yeah, so here's the, again, this calls the animation. This defines the keyframes. So normally you'd see keyframes, or it'd be at keyframes, ball bounce. Again, even current versions of Chrome require the WebKit prefix. So you'd either see from and to for the beginning keyframe and end keyframe, or you can do percents. So for the percent of time. It starts at 0%, uses those properties. So that's absent positioning. Top 30% left 0. There's a CSS transform there. Scale X and Y 1, 1. Then there's additional, you could do easing on the whole animation. What I'm doing here is doing easing on each keyframe. So it eases out, eases in, eases out. And I'm also, on the middle keyframe only, I've added a box shadow.
How do you transition into another keyframe? Is there a callback function or anything when the first one might be complete?
It figures that out on its own. If I were to say 20% save.
Did you say 20% and call another keyframe?
I don't think it was callbacks. I think
Yeah, there's definitely no callbacks.
Time both, so that one starts after this one finishes.
But you can't have one communicate with the other one?
I don't think so.
Yeah, that's definitely not possible, and I'll show you the next thing I'll talk about can do that. The CSS3 cannot synchronize multiple animations on its own, at least.
How does this handle overlaps with other elements?
It should behave within the normal, properties of z-indexes. It should work.
So if you have,
Although I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't completely, especially with like iOS that always had problems with sort of z-indexes. And yeah, it should work. Question on?
like you covered, basically I was about to say all other CSS rules still apply about z-index or
Yeah.
positioning overlaps. And stuff.
Yeah. So anyway, that's kind of that example. Pretty simple. So, oh, here's another great example of using that. This little flashless animation link I have here. So this person, Rachel Neighbors, has a lot of really good animation tutorials and articles out there. I came across her stuff a lot when I was doing some research for this. And yeah, this, doing a walk cycle. So, pretty cool. This is using a CSS3 animation.
Pure CSS? Jeez.
It's pure CSS plus plus this, an image sprite. So it's kind of cheating. It's not all CSS. You've got to make an image.
With the right images.
But basically, what the CSS, you can use this animation keyframe technique to step through each of these images, move the background image around, making it look like frame by frame animation. And if you have enough of those frames put together, it's going to look smooth. So a lot of animation, as it has always been, involves kind of, tricking people, making something look like it's really complicated and magical, but it's really just, using simple, basic properties and techniques. Motion, time, things like that.
You know if there's a limitation on frames per second? Sprites.
There probably is. I would think that 60 is going to be the maximum. And I have heard that, again, browsers will slow the frame rate down if they need to. That's what CSS3 does sort of automatically. Browsers have control over that, and you don't.
That example's at 24.
What?
That example's at 24 frames per second.
Is it? Oh, yeah. Yeah, so that's another property that I have used, but steps. That's an animation property. So anyway, that's kind of a neat little technique I came across. So that is CSS3 keyframes. And that is, as far as being supported, pretty well supported. Although you see these little dashes here, these mean you have to use prefixes. So it's well supported, but you have to use a lot of browser prefixes. WebKit dash, well, Safari uses WebKit, and Opera has its own. So let me show you what you might have to, what you might want to do if you've got to really actually use this and do a lot of these. Instead of duplicating all your work and manually doing that. There's a lot of sites out there that you can build animations on and it'll generate the code for you. That's kind of a neat thing. But if you are into using CSS preprocessors like SAS and less to programmatically help you make lots of CSS and control it, this is something I found and popped it into brackets, which can work with SAS and less. So this is a CSS mix-in, basically. This is going to make all of these different browser prefixed versions for me. And that's pretty neat. SAS and less, the learning curve isn't that really hard, but very, very powerful, can save you a ton of time. So what this generates, once I combine my one CSS file, have it be processed through the SAS compiler, that is going to spit out this. So this is compiled CSS, and the important part is this. So the SAS compiler generated this version for me, and the Mozilla Firefox version, and the Opera version, and the unprefixed normal version that eventually that's all we'll need to use. So stuff like that can save you a lot of time. And again, it's if you work with CSS a lot, if you do front end work, definitely look into preprocessors. Does anybody use those? SAS or less? Okay.
What's the overhead to build something like that into a SAS or less environment? How long would it take to build a preprocessor? Is that something all done manually and then it generates that for you? CSS?
So this is the mix-in. To build this mix-in, I didn't do this. I just found it. I could build it. It would just probably take me a few hours. You know, so I found this pretty quickly. It works almost how I want it to. There's one thing that it didn't do, but I found that pretty quickly. This is basically using variables to plug things into to build CSS. That's what this lets you do. And
So essentially you try and search for variables out there to build your own mix and tweak them as needed.
that's one way to do it. Basically, so this is what I did. So this is my code, the include directive. This is what tells the SAS compiler to build it using this information, run it through that mixin, which makes all the copies with the different versions. And this is what I noticed. This internal easing property, that mixin that I found, didn't do that. So I'd have to do some more work to make that work. But anyway.
You can't add all these prefixes to the same selector, right? Commas, you know what I mean?
For some CSS selectors, you can do that. It didn't seem to work when I tried it really quick for this one. Because a lot of browsers, if they don't understand a selector in a group list, they drop the whole thing. That's the problem. Anyway.
You needed Ruby to do SAS, right?
There's lots of ways to do it, which is cool. I use either the brackets SAS extension, which it doesn't use the Ruby version, but it can. So basically, SAS is a language, and there's different ways to compile it. And there's extensions for brackets. You can do it online. Plug it into a thing, into a site. It'll build it for you. If you use Visual Studio, there's a really good extension called Web Essentials that does SAS and less. And you can use, node, grunts, those kind of command line utilities to automatically look for it. All right, so that's a little bit about CSS3 keyframes and SAS. So this stuff, Web Animation API and WebGL API. This is stuff that is not quite yet terribly usable, as you might notice here. Big old, red cannot do. So it's up and coming. So this is kind of like where CSS3 was a couple years ago. Pretty soon you'll be able to use this. But as of now, you probably don't want to use it, at least if you need to do public production work that has to work for lots of people. Anyway, so Web Animation API. So this is, again, a JavaScript API. So you have to do this with JavaScript programming. But it provides CSS3-like performance. That's the key point. A lot of JavaScript techniques are performance intensive and slow down the whole browser. You might get janky transitions and things like that. So this is going to be smooth and work very well. And it kind of does builds upon what CSS3 keyframes can do, but it provides more power with things like synchronizing multiple animations. That's key for doing things like nesting. If you have like a figure with a walk cycle and the legs have to move independently, all those pieces have to be animating in of themselves, and then the whole thing, gets animated. Motion paths, things like that. So back to Rachel Neighbors. And for a lot of these new technologies, you'll find little examples like this. So a little code pen, there's many other little sites like this. So these are little web applications really that let you see the code, change it even, and run it. So on the left, we have CSS animation. On the right, this is using Web Animation API, more JavaScript based. One of the differences here is that if you add multiple cats, you will notice that the CSS3 ones are not and cannot be synchronized, whereas the web animation ones can be. So that's one feature. Yes.
What's the file format of the cat? Is it a GIF, PNG? What?
Yeah, that's just a big PNG sprites.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
That's the best one to use.
It should be a PNG at least. I don't know what it is.
GIF. It's PNG.
Yep. Anyway, so that's kind of one example. Let's see if the JavaScript here is remotely understandable and legible. Could always. Yes, a lot of this looks very similar. Let me pull this into brackets. Okay, once you save a file in brackets with an extension, then you get code coloring. So this is JavaScript. And again, a lot of this, like the first two chunks up there, are very similar to the CSS3 animation. It's the same exact properties there. And you know, this is not using jQuery, it looks like. So this is plain JavaScript, so it's a little bit more abstract if you're used to jQuery, which is an easy way to get into JavaScript, of course. So this is basically saying, you know, get the cat element and animate. That's the web, you know, that tells it to use the web animation API. And at the bottom, this is the part that synchronizes them, really. Start time equals start time. Match those values. And then add a new cat.
You offset them by a specific value.
Yes, you definitely could. You would say, you know, cat running dot start time plus something.
And then they would run exactly the same opposite.
Yep. So yeah, that's something, you know, web animation API, definitely keep an eye on that. That's going to be super powerful because it's native and high performing when it works for more people.
So you're not downloading the library, it's calling an API and just pulling functions
Yeah.
down as needed.
Browsers will know how to do that. Built in with no external libraries. That's, again, is the cool part. All right, so that's Web Animation API. WebGL, another API, will be supported natively eventually. This one's a little bit even less probably supported. And WebGL is 3D. You can do 2D with it. It's, you know, unique thing is that it's 3D rendering in a browser. The other unique thing about it is that not only do you have to have a browser that supports it, you've got to have a video card, a graphics processor unit that can do this. So that's kind of a level of, you know, requirement beyond browser that's not much else has. But you get the benefits of native 3D rendering, which, if it works, is going to be very fast and powerful and efficient.
I'm going way back, forgive me, but remember the IEEE 1394?
The what?
IEEE 1394 processing card, going way back.
Okay.
You don't need that kind of card, you need something strong.
No, well, it's going to be, I would guess that most graphics cards, most modern graphics cards, and you know, even mobile devices should be able to do this. I haven't actually looked into that quite yet myself, though. So some WebGL demos. I'll just show you one. I mean, there's some crazy stuff you could do. 3D rendering, no plugins, in a browser. You know, you can crank this up and I mean, so you know, people have turned like 3D game engines into browser experiences now. The Unreal Engine, you know, was put on the web. Pretty cool stuff. So that is WebGL. Keep an eye on that. And get good at JavaScript. So that's kind of the native stuff. Again, high performance, built in. Eventually it will be at least. The next thing I want to talk about is a run through of JavaScript libraries. So this requires, you know, JavaScript skills. Some of this is very, very easy, some of it's not. jQuery itself has a .animate property. That's very, very commonly used, very easy to use. You know, you just say jQuery.animate, you know, give it some time, easing, tell it what CSS properties to change, it'll do it. And, you know, so just for that, CSS3 can now do really what that does. But jQuery is going to be very backwards compatible. And again, it's, you know, integratable with other JavaScript, of course. So that's very common. jQuery.animate, though, is kind of a performance killer. So if you have a lot of other animation going on, a lot of other JavaScript, jQuery animate can slow down everything else. So, you know, it's fine for simple stuff, but at a certain level, you definitely want to go beyond that. Velocity.js is an easy way to go beyond that. It kind of tries to duplicate what jQuery.animate does, but it gives you better performance. So that's pretty neat. And Velocity's website, if you're interested in the whole performance issue, has a lot of good information on what makes, you know, things good and bad as far as performance. And a lot of it has to do with you know, how browsers behind the scenes render things. So what you want to try to do is minimize the amount of times that a browser has to redraw the screen. So a lot of animation techniques would be trying to redraw the screen while other stuff is processing, and you get overlapping, you know, non-orchestrated, you know, loops going on. That just sort of kills everything. So, you know, Velocity tries to overcome that, manage things better, and give you much, much better performance. So that's a good one, Velocity. GreenSock, has anybody heard of this? Cool. This is a workhorse, high performance, very, very powerful animation library. It's been around for a long time. It can be used within Flash, which is how a lot of people use it. So like you can use the same basic, you know, syntax and functions in Flash ActionScript and in JavaScript. It's pretty neat. So this is actually behind the scenes on a lot of other you know, animation things, like this parallax library, Scroll Magic. That's powered by GreenSock. The GreenSock is really cool. Again, it's going to be very well supported. You know, JavaScript has the ability to go back and make IE7 work if somebody develops it that way. So GreenSock is really powerful. A lot of tutorials. It's not terribly difficult to get into if you're, you know, if you have some JavaScript skills. One of the other things that GreenSock lets you do is it's sort of component based. So if you just need simple tweening through JavaScript, you can use the single tween light library, which is really, really small. I think it's like 7 kilobytes. You know, it's native, well, it's not native, it's plain JavaScript. So there's no jQuery, nothing to slow you down. It's pretty powerful. If you need to go beyond that, there's Tween Max, and there's timelines, and all sorts of other plugins. So it's kind of a build your own component-based JavaScript animation library. And that's going to be, you know, probably one of the most commonly used high-end JavaScript libraries out there for this purpose. Scroll position, aka parallax. So this is a pretty fun technique. I've been doing a bit of this past couple years. My website has some parallax layers, which is basically, different images moving in different directions and fading out and stuff over time. That's all that it's really doing. Animating CSS position and scale properties. Just fun to sit here and play with. That's kind of why I built it.
How far back in browsers you built that?
I'm using the library called, I'm using Scroller. That I think can go back to IE7. Yeah, as far as you would need to go back to. Yeah, so parallax is what that kind of means as far as what it's doing is it's looking at your position on the page, usually vertically, but some can be horizontal as well. But if you think of your scroll bar as a timeline controller, this is keyframe 1, this is the end keyframe. Parallax changes things over time based on the scroll position. So it's kind of hard to wrap your head around at first maybe when you're trying to put it all together, but that's basically what it's doing.
How's that affected by resolution? How all your scroll bar is?
It's up to you to make that happen. Like I've got one page on my site that isn't tall enough to scroll. So instead I just added some CSS3 keyframe animation to just force it to do it. There's no scrolling. CSS3 just does this at a certain point in time, just because I wanted to have some effects on each page. Anyway. So yeah, parallax libraries, pretty popular these days. Scroller is an easy one to get into. You basically tell it to use that JavaScript file and you plug in CSS properties. It's all CSS based. Scroll Magic is more powerful. It's more JavaScript based. Again, it runs GreenSock behind the scenes, and it has the ability to do more kind of triggering of complex scenes within the scrolling.
I'm just looking at these libraries and you heard of Scrollorama.
Yeah, Scroll Magic is based on Scrollorama, but it's better, supposedly.
So what's your recommendation?
My recommendation would be look at this comparison page, because this will tell you what to use. But as a summary, if you're more of a designer and you're used to CSS and you need sort of simple uses, Scroller is going to be a lot easier to deal with. Scroll Magic is more powerful if you're into JavaScript.
And that's better than Scrollorama.
Scroll Magic is supposedly better than Scrollorama. I haven't used Scrollorama. And there's a lot of other ones too. Yeah.
It's actually pretty.
So this is a site real quick that my company did. I didn't get a chance to work on it, but other people did. So this uses Scroll Magic, a lot of other things. Triggering scenes, triggering things to happen within certain points. This is something Scroller couldn't do, but Scroll Magic did. Pretty neat.
What's it look like on a phone?
It is dumbed down on a phone because phones, when you're scrolling things on a phone, they pause JavaScript execution until you're done scrolling, which makes things like this not really possible. So most of these parallax libraries, though, try to work around that and basically force there to be a giant div tag or something, and that scrolls. So it's possible to make an experience like this on a phone, but it definitely takes a lot of extra work. And again, the performance, this is pretty intensive even on a desktop. So, it might not be worth it even if you did spend the time to get it working well.
Is there any sense of user fatigue for these types of stuff?
I would think so, yes. So you definitely have to have a good reason to spend the effort making this and think about your UX very, very, closely. somebody's sitting here wondering what to do, that's not a good thing. So there's a scroll thing, there's an arrow, there's navigation. So this is, I think the art directors call this storytelling websites, experiential websites. You're taking somebody on a journey, not just showing them like a spreadsheet of information.
I was just doing like middle view, like tab. Is it? Are you adjusting all these images? You know what I mean? Just things get wacky as you not mobile view, but it's say like a middle media query. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that'll take a lot of extra work to make it. To do something like this at a fixed width and height is one thing, but then to make it responsive, yeah, you've got to think about a lot of things. You've got to think about what's happening at different positions, have everything scale, play well together. It's a lot of work for sure.
You're scaling every image.
Yeah. So this, like, the file size of this page was 11 megabytes before I added some lazy loading to load the secondary images only when they were needed.
They're all PNG files.
No, backgrounds are going to be JPEGs. If something needs transparency, it's going to be a PNG. Yep.
The JPEGs are lighter.
You would think it
All right. So I am running out of time here. So one more little JS thing to mention, and that is data visualization. D3, it's a pretty cool library. I've been looking into this a lot lately for an upcoming project. So data visualization, all these are little demos. And some of them, yeah, this one. So this is JavaScript rendering, and this can be used for charts, all sorts of crazy things. But anyway, this D3 JavaScript library includes physics engines and things like that, and has its own animation methods built into it. It's kind of it's its own syntax you have to learn, but it is pretty well thought out and powerful. So this is what makes all that happen. A bunch of JavaScript, a lot of math. So Calculus 2 was a long time ago for me. Anyway, D3, very, very cool. And this one is just static, it looks like, but a lot of these examples are very animated. Yeah, like that's really cool. Whatever it's doing, I don't know. It's Voronoi tessellation. So yes, that is JavaScript. All right, so that's native stuff, and those are some JavaScript libraries you want to be aware of. Know the options. It's worth mentioning the video. You can still use video, and anything that appears in a video can be on a website. So don't forget that. If you have After Effects skills, that's an easy way to get animation on the web. Question?
How many good ways to trigger link points on video?
Yeah, there is a web, I think it's an HTML5 video API with time events, I think. If not, you can certainly do that through your JavaScripts. Yep. Adobe Muse, kind of an InDesign-like way to make websites, has some parallax and animation features built into it. It's kind of a niche way to do a website, but for some uses, it's pretty neat. I know that Ascend offers classes on Muse, and it's pretty fun. Edge Animate. So, if you have used Flash to do animation, you might want to check out Edge Animate because it is very Flash-like, but it produces, actually JavaScript is kind of the workhorse, but it uses HTML elements, CSS3 styles, and JavaScript. So this has been around for a couple years now. I've got some good resources here. And Ascend also offers a class on that, I see. Here is Edge Animates. So it's got this nice, modern CC dark look that I like. Lessons built in, close that stuff. All right, so this is a project I did 2 years ago or so, and here's what it looks like. So it's kind of like a brochure type of thing, and this was originally done in Flash, and my job was to make this not Flash, so it worked on an iPad, which it does. So it's all JavaScript, but if you try to think of doing like this scene programmatically, how many keyframes you would have to manually create, all the properties one by one in code. You know, so doing animation via code is possible and it's neat, but it is way time consuming for complex things. So you really need to think about what you need to have happen, how much time and budget you have, and you know, animation is time consuming, even with Edge, which speeds it up a lot. So anyway, this is basically a little animated slideshow thing with some navigation controls. And this was the first time I ever touched Edge. This is the project I did, and it worked out pretty well. I was able to jump into it with no prior experience in Edge and do a pretty good project, you know, on time, on budget, with a rough estimate.
Performance is comparable.
It's very, yeah, it performs very well. So here's what Edge looks like. So a lot of this is a lot like Flash again. The panels might be in different places, but you got like a stage on the left. Newer versions of Edge, like CC 2014.1, add the ability to do responsive scaling. That was not there 2 years ago, so the whole thing can scale. That's very nice, of course. Let me zoom out my timeline.
Kelly, have you used the latest version?
Yeah.
You just mentioned.
Yeah. So it's a lot like Flash, and you can scrub the timeline, see what's going on. Instead of Flash layers, you have HTML elements here, which basically function like layers. You know, what's on top visibly shows up on what's beneath. You've got an elements panel. So this tells me most of my things are divs. There's kind of two ways to select things. So it's very similar to Flash. It's like easy to pick up, but there are some, you know, nuances that are pretty important. Let me just look at like this.
Would come out on unified.
Yeah, I'll show you the code in a second. So here's an example. So the neat thing about this is, you know, you've got really nice kind of zoom control, and it displays the properties that you're animating. You know, like you make keyframes very similar to Flash. So this is the thing that I've selected, one of those arrows, which is actually a symbol, which has nested animation within it. So Edge can do that. That's a very useful thing, of course. So these are the properties that it's changing. So there's the display, you know, display left and top for movements, scale, and rotation. You see a little keyframe that shows me the values right there, easing. So it's very fast and powerful. Question?
Like your back image there, that is
Most everything here is bitmap artwork. Just because, I mean, that's what I had already to work with. Some things I probably recreated. This bag actually has little bubbles in it. So Edge cannot do masking. Flash's ability to mask on a vector shape is really handy, and really nothing else can do that I've seen. But anyway, nested animation is possible. There's no direct conversion, unfortunately.
Are there any third-party exports from Flash recommend or HTML5 version?
Rich is going to talk about that.
Here they exist.
So let me show you the code that Edge makes. So basically what you end up with after an Edge project is an HTML page with nothing in it. So this is not the most, well, it's not at all semantic or SEO friendly. So it's really good for making an animatable chunk, like a composition like that thing that I did. It's really good at that. If you need to make a whole website that's animated, this is probably not the best way to do it, although you could use Edge in that way. The JavaScript that it spits out is this. So it's got a lot of minified stuff you don't want to touch. A whole lot of it. But again,
The underlying elements are all HTML and CSS.
yeah, but it makes them through JavaScript.
Is it not true in the latest version you don't have to use jQuery if you don't want to? Like,
Correct. Yeah. So the old version of Edge Animate used jQuery. This doesn't. So that means less, download time. It's a smaller bundle. And the other thing that Edge does have, which is really nice, is oops. Oh, I'm on brackets. That's right. Edge has the ability to create JavaScript actions in it. Show you that real quick. Where's my I don't think so. Well, some of it isn't minified, like this. This is kind of the behind the scenes. I can't really increase the size of it. But anyway, Edge does expose a lot of its inner workings to you. So like, I'm adding text via jQuery basically. So you can access the Edge API to do stuff manually or to add to its functionality, like the navigation buttons I had. Some of that's custom. And Paul Tranny, who's a famous evangelist dude that I teach with, he has a little tutorial on integrating GreenSock with Edge. So you can do a lot of integration with other things through Edge's, just open access to its own JavaScript code. And it also tells you in some places, when it makes JavaScript for you, it'll tell you don't mess with this line, you might break things. So it's pretty good about that.
There's no native mobile version of this stuff, is there?
This runs on mobile devices.
Native like Objective-C, iOS. Not like a hybrid HTML.
Not that I have heard of, no. So that is my whirlwind tour of web animation. And I will hand it over to Rich now.